Well, hello, everybody. I'm Ed Parco. I'm here with Brian Galkey, and we are
Hey, buddy.
ACES53. And Brian, what's ACES53?
That is the best hand in poker, right? Which is four aces and a joker or wild card that Ed was introduced to when he was in college.
Yeah, so long ago when they had
Yeah.
faxes. Yeah, back that far. Yeah. So, I mean, I was introduced to it because I was in sales, because that's where I thought I wanted to go into, and that's where I ended up going into. And my instructor said, remember 4 aces and a joker. Aces stand for attitude, commitment, enthusiasm, and smile. That's what you have. And the joker is that unique ability you bring to the table, and it can be something that is learned. If you don't have it, you can learn. And what I found out for years after selling by the phone, mine was my voice. And I didn't know that until I started wearing headphones and being on radio.
Aha.
Yeah. So that's what we do now is we kind of go through those 4 things, and then we bring that person with that unique ability on Thursday to try to help you grow and create your own ability if you don't have a natural one. Yeah.
Yep. So we're here twice a week. And who's
because that ability could be good looking, unlike Brian.
I know.
It could be some really attractive person, and that's what you use in sales. And unfortunately for Brian, he doesn't have that. So
I don't.
He's not handsome.
We both have faces made for radio.
That's right. And one of us has a voice for it.
That's true. Damn it, not me,
Jim. Damn it, Jim. I'm a doctor. All right, and so today we're going to. Why don't you tell us who our guest is, and I'll bring him in.
Sure. So what we're going to bring in is somebody we met through a mutual mastermind group that we're a part of, right? And so it's Anshar. So what's interesting is he was 75% nonverbal all the way up to age 11. And then he basically had to connect with others, which he had to figure out how to do it. And it took a little bit of studying psychology, neuroscience, and he's turned that almost into like a superpower where now he actually goes out and he teaches business communication, interpersonal dynamics, and he works with everybody from solopreneurs to entrepreneurs, to corporations, and then individuals. But the industries he works in are very interesting because I think his first job was actually service merchandise, for anybody who remembers what that was, when he went in and started creating these training programs. But then he even teaches, I'll let him talk about who he talks to sometimes on how to recruit customers and how tonality and everything is important. With that,
when you say solar, you don't mean solar entrepreneurs. You mean solo.
Okay, yes, an enterprise of one. Yes,
I'm sure he will speak better than we do. So.
Yes.
All right, I'll bring him in. Let's bring him in. Hello, sir. How you doing today?
Better than most, and that's good as some. I suppose I can't complain.
Well, I guess we all can complain. It's just a matter who's going to listen to us anymore.
Right.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, so we all met a few years ago, just really fascinating with what he works on and the story he has about coming, like I said, it was service merchandise where you first started, right? When you started doing sales and teams and everything.
I was working in information technology for about 15 years. So when I got into sales, that's where I started, just inside of my own wheelhouse. And then it kind of evolved from there. And I was evolving my social skills because when I was, like you were saying, when I was 11, I was 75% nonverbal, and a lot of difficulty controlling the tone of my voice. It would just kind of change mid-sentence over and over again. Wasn't able to make eye contact, use reciprocal like facial expressions, gesticulations. I had a lot of challenges. I didn't even get my driver's license till I was 37. So autism's been, some people think autism is a superpower, and sometimes it is, but it definitely comes with kryptonite too. Yeah. And, learning to deal with all of that and get outside of my shell. I was very socially isolated, used to walk around with my arms crossed, just looking at the ground, wasn't able to talk to anybody. And when I got to about 25, after I'd finally gotten a diagnosis after being in the Navy, I had to kind of figure out, well, where do I go from here? And, at that point, when you have autism, you get all kinds of little special interests. It can be anything from, puzzles or chess or, figurines or board games or, the brass work on bridges, whatever it is that your brain decides to point at. And so I asked myself kind of an interesting question, because at that point I had like 50 special interests. And I said, well, what if I made my special interests psychology and cognitive neuroscience? Like, how would that change things? That was what was so hard for me, was understanding other people, social cues, and there's just so much. There's a lot of challenges to overcome. And when I did that, my whole world changed. Everything changed for me. And I started to get not just an understanding of myself, but also those missing things that I wasn't able to pick up on from being outside of the kind of neurotypical, sociological phenomenon. And that was really hard. And it was a big challenge. But I eventually, because I love putting myself into challenging situations because that's how you grow. I actually got myself involved with Kay Jewelers and Jared Gallery of Jewelry, largest retail jeweler in the United States. And that was a terrifying step for me because that's a purely emotional psychosocial product that has completely, dependent value from person to person. And most of the reasons that people are visiting are emotional, and you have to build emotional relationships, not only with the clientele, but you're helping them build emotional relationships with the people that are important in their lives. And so it really it was a trial by fire for me. When I first took a look at that industry, I was like, God, that's going to be impossible. Let's do it. So once I did that, I started as a part-time sales associate. And after 7 years, not only was I running my own $2 million unit, but when all the stores would come together and we were doing training, they would actually let me do it. And so I got to train just hundreds of sales associates and assistant managers and store managers. And they're all out still in that industry, all with their own stores and stuff. So it got rid of imposter syndrome, which, can be a real pain in the ass. Just because once you can replicate skills and give them to other people and then watch them succeed, you don't really get the latitude to doubt yourself anymore. So once I got all of that psychosocial sapience, I ended up moving again industries. And then for a while, I was actually designing.
Anshar, sorry. I want to have a conversation with you.
Sure.
All right. So I want to go back. You said you were in the Navy. What'd you do in the Navy?
Crypto. So
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that. I just want to thank you for your service. I'm a veteran. I'm also in the Navy. I was a corpsman. So.
Oh, awesome. Needle sticker.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was with the Marines, so we'll just move on. Yeah. All right. So thanks. I mean, I want to have a kind of conversation here because it's important. And I know that sometimes when you're talking on these, you just go, because I do a lot of these. And so you kind of want to break it up a little bit. But going back to Kay Jewelers, like that's huge for you because you don't have technically that emotional side that other people have, right?
Not the same. Not at all.
Right.
And so I don't think people understand that part of the conversation and how you had to overcome it. So can you talk about that a little bit? And then we can get into more in depth, if you don't mind.
Well, in order for
hold on, one more thing. And the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of people go that, we don't have autism, but we have doubts and other things we feel that we can't overcome. And you overcame it huge in something that you don't have. And I think that's important for people to know.
And I have a question to go along with that. Would people be able, like the movie The Accountant, if people have seen that movie, do you feel like that was an accurate portrayal?
The thing is that when you have autism spectrum disorder, what it really means is that you're kind of forced to look at the world through a magnifying glass, and you only look at one thing at a time. And that one thing that you're looking at overwhelms you with so much input that your brain has to kind of split apart, segregate, and sort that input in order for it to be tolerable. When you don't have intellectual impairments or other comorbidities, then that can sometimes look like you being able to systemize information really easily, which is why sometimes people will say like autism is a superpower. But the flip side of it is that it can give you a lot of sensory processing issues. When you get input, it's just this gigantic wave of information for your brain. And sometimes it's so overwhelming that we'll have to mix it with familiar input in order to be able to make it tolerable. So if I heard a loud noise or something overstimulated me, I might have started doing like vestibular stimulation, which is like rocking, echolalia, which is like repetition of like sounds or tones. And what you're really doing is kind of layering extra input on top of that. It's a spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. And depending on where you are on the spectrum, because there's lots of different comorbidities, there's like a 40 to 60% comorbidity with ADHD, for example. Each one of those different things where you have that Venn diagram where it crosses over will actually change some of the manifestations and behavior and symptoms for people on the spectrum. And that's why they refer to it as a spectrum. And, for me, I have a pretty high facility with language. I didn't talk a lot when I was younger, but I had a special interest in words. And, I've gone through a lot of really rough challenges in my life. But despite all that, if I were to describe myself on the spectrum, I would say that I have low support needs, and that I don't necessarily have to have like a live-in caretaker. I don't have to have, a lot of special education accommodations anymore. And there are a lot of people with a lot of challenges. So it's really difficult to paint it with a big brush. And they did integrate all of that together in the DSM just to make sure that people had equal access to treatment. But it can sometimes make the definition a little difficult to get to the root of.
Ed?
I just thought you ran away to go do something. That's why you threw Anshar in the middle of there, because that way people couldn't see you running away doing stuff.
No, I wanted to see his link in big letters.
All right. No, I mean, so, all right. So now let's get into how did you overcome a lot of the stuff that you have to do? Because then people can relate, well, he had to do this, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal for me to do this. You follow what I'm getting? I mean,
yeah, no, I get
you had
that.
some major, I have a daughter with special needs, and she's nowhere, and hers is like, she'll never be more than a toddler the rest of her life. You didn't have that. You have a unique with autism is on many different levels and many different scales. So it just depends. I mean, because they can put entrepreneurs in the room and read off, do you have this? Do you have this? And at the end, it's basically saying you have autism, right? And so I just want people to understand more of this, because it's huge what you've been able to do. Yeah.
If it gives you context, I wasn't really able to hold a conversation with anyone. I would walk around with my arms crossed like this, pretty much, looking at the ground. And I didn't have my first real friend that wasn't just me doing a shared activity with someone else, just parallel play, until I was about 25 years old. And so it was really, really crippling. And when you have autism, it's very difficult to, like, for example, look at a human face while you're talking, because that input invades what you're trying to do. So for me, that manifestation was that I would look down at the ground, had a very monotone, when I finally got that tone control, I wasn't able to play with it at all at first. And no eye contact, no social reciprocity, but also missed social cues, because there's almost kind of like you're outside of the circle a little bit and you process things differently. So when people are expecting certain emotional reactions from you, you don't have those things naturally, and that can be really challenging. And it can cause people to assign those symptoms as character traits sometimes, thinking maybe that you're being a jerk or something when they don't know what's going on with you.
All right. So how did you overcome this? Did you study people, or, I mean, because where now you teach this, right, to people. So how did you go from where you are? Did you, I just kind of want to know how you guys from that. And then then were you able to teach it because you had to study it for so long?
Well, my cup was really empty to start, and I wasn't sure what approach to take. So what I did, what a lot of people who on the spectrum do, which is I tried to learn how to mask, which just means trying to pretend to be neurotypical like everybody else. And that's a good skill, and it can serve you in a pinch. But the longer that you do it, it starts to cause all kinds of problems, because you don't have any of the social knowledge that you need to actually be able to blend in. And as I got better and better at that process, I realized that it was the wrong skill to have. And it was because that social behavior is inherently dishonest in a way. You're kind of pretending to be someone that you're not. And it kept me from being able to really connect with people. And so when I made psychology and cognitive neuroscience into my autistic special interest, I started to really take a studious approach to everything. Like I literally have hundreds of pictures of my face trying out different facial expressions, 100 recordings of me trying to pronounce words differently, use different spacing, different tone. How do I convey emotion? I had to basically build everything from the ground up. And when I would be teaching salespeople, they already had their own set of skills, and they just needed to polish them with some extra information. But because I had to deconstruct everything literally from a foundation up, whatever step in the process they were in, it was really easy for me because I already had so much more to do. And I didn't have any bad habits. I didn't have any habits. So my cup was really empty. And when I started to understand the brain a lot better, that was when it started to really change my approach. It went from me researching the methods that other people had come up with and starting to invent my own. And I never in a million years would have thought that I would be teaching that. But after I went through that whole process, I realized that the process of deconstructing and and annotating that whole process so that I could do it actually made it much easier for me to be able to transmit to other people. And it also made me better at it. You know, sometimes the best way to learn is by teaching. And it just kind of failed upward, I guess.
Right. Now, you'd mentioned in a different interview that we watched that when you were a kid, you loved the sound of words.
Oh, yeah.
And so you would pick very, very large words because you liked the way that they sounded. But you also mentioned at the beginning of this interview that your tone was up and down the entire time you spoke. So how did you learn to control the tonality and to kind of get your point across if you don't necessarily feel the emotions the same way that some people feel like they do? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So my mother's a voice teacher. And so for the longest time, I just avoided the noise at home, you know, because we had 2 music teachers in the house, 40 families a week, musical instruments, you know, kids murdering Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star on violins. And when you've got sensory processing disorder from autism, that's hell. That's hell in a handbasket. You know, I didn't have to put myself under the hot water in the tub just to turn off the noise and have a break for a minute. But as I started to get interested in taking some of those impairments that I had and working on them, just started to use vocal techniques for singing really helped me. And I noticed that when I was doing like singing warm-ups, like the same thing that my that voice students learn, that started to expand my speaking range and I started to get more muscle control. But I also realized that your emotional anxiety, fight or flight, that can actually change your pitch. It can change the muscle control in your throat. But interestingly, as I got to higher levels of psychology, there are parts of the brain that process that from the listening perspective. And you can actually start to unconsciously project those emotions onto your listeners, which was really interesting. And so that gave me even more motivation to develop more control.
Wow.
So I don't want to interrupt your tones thing, so keep going.
Yeah. So I like the tonality. So then how did you transfer that, not just how to talk to people on a generic conversational level, to deciding when I'm going to be cold calling, you know, sales call type situations? How did you then modify it from just interpersonal interaction to the sales activity with tonality?
The problem that I had is it was very difficult for me to identify which set of vocal tones I should use. And knowing what was appropriate for different situations was really difficult. So because I didn't have an innate sense to be able to intuit that, I actually started going through the human decision-making process instead. Because if I could identify the psychological state that a person's in, and then identify what the desired result was for that communication, then that could dictate my approach. And whereas other people might intuit their way through that process, I created a concrete process that actually delineated, you know, emotional and cognitive objections and frameworks, and then was able to assign tones to that. But the starting point of all of that is building rapport. And when you're moving into sales, you know, the closer that you can get into a person's peer group, peer dynamics are really crucial because they cause cognitive reframing in the way that you are perceived, whether or not you are antagonistically selling them something, or, you know, they're worried about you swindling them or something like that. But as you start to move closer and closer to a person's peer group, and they understand, you know, that they're able to start moving you a little bit closer. You're no longer just a stranger, and you start to have things in common with them, and they can relate to you. Then you start to get much more genuine reactions from people. So much so that once you establish a certain level of peer dynamics with people, you can actually cause neurophysiological changes in them, because they'll start experiencing the physical manifestations of things that happen to you in their own brain. And, you know, you can observe this by like watching a group of people, really close friends. And if you kick one of them between the legs, you'll actually see all of them lean over as if they got kicked in between the legs themselves. And that's because as we start to move people into our peer groups, we start to engage, you know, not just mirror neurons, because that can be a little bit of a contentious subject in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, but there's a set of associated systems that allow us to be able to project empathy and to include or disinclude people inside of our peer groups. And as you start to move in and out of that, not only do people care, but you actually start to be able to modify the context of their thoughts and emotions. And it's really powerful. So that's where it starts. And being able to identify how to start with your vocal tone and pitch control comes down to the communication style that the person that you're talking to is using. And it's very easy to identify the second you start looking for it. And there's just two basic dynamics. One of them is pace. Are they a more deliberately paced person in their communication, or are they a more rapid communicator? But then the second dynamic of that is focus. And that's, are they using a lot of fact-based, concrete, intuitive ideas when they're communicating? Or do they focus on feeling and sensation? And you could ask the same person, two different people the same question. Say, what'd you do in your last vacation? And when they describe that, one person will say, oh, we went here and there and did this and did that and did this, and give you a laundry list of things. The other person might tell you about the experiences that they took away from that. And one of the important things about that rapport building process is that you can actually start to make some mental notations of baselines for everything from body language to pupil dilatory responses, capillary refill responses in the lip. There's a whole bunch of things, because there's no one system for body language that you can just memorize like a roadmap and just snap your fingers. It's all contextual. There are certain physiological and neurophysiological changes that can be associated with like amygdalic responses in the midbrain. But a lot of the manifestations can be cultural, social, personal, contextual. So establishing a baseline for that before you start going into a presentation, even if peer dynamics weren't as powerful as they are, it starts to give you a sense of zeroing out the counter so that you start to be able to notice variances. And when a person starts to flag, whether or not you're moving in the right direction or the wrong direction, you'll be able to identify it because you've been paying attention.
Wow.
All right. So I got a huge question for you.
Yeah.
Sure.
You've said all this stuff and you'd say how we should do it and everything. With your background where you are, do you relate to it or you just understand it? Are you the feeling, you know what I mean? Because you're saying that how we can build rapport, we can do this and we do that. But coming from your background with your autism, is it foreign to, you're saying it? Are you, and please don't think it's wrong, but is it like Spock where he can say the stuff but he doesn't really feel it, but he can say and tell you how to do it? Is that kind of how you come across? Or have you finally over time been able to start really feeling what you're talking about? Are you following me here?
Yeah, I think that the internal processing of emotions and experiences is different for everyone. And the mechanisms of empathy weren't the same for me on the autism spectrum to start. But what I noticed is that as I started to get more and more into the systems that different types of people use, I was able to translate their language to mine. Okay. And once that gate opened, I was genuinely able to understand, their emotional situation, to relate it to my own experiences. And that was something that I was missing to start with. And that was something that was powerful for me.
What I'm getting at is you can learn this is what I'm getting at, no matter what your background is and that kind of stuff. And that's all I was trying to get at. So people understood that even if it's foreign to you, even while you're learning, over time, you'll understand it better and feel it and come across as genuine. So.
Well, and the brain makes connections in that way too, so that it is a process of experience. But I think that once you start using techniques and you see that they're working, the rush that you get from that, especially when it starts to provide fuel for positively driven experiences and interactions and sales and success, it starts to create more of those positive flashbulb memories that are associated, like in the nucleus accumbens, that pleasure response, basal ganglia, and it makes just like the brain naturally records stress and negative stuff. But when you have a positive interaction, sometimes we fail to celebrate it and it doesn't make that connection. And when you start to connect ideas and you've taken the time to do it out of intention, then you are creating positively driven memories. And it does start to create a cognitive impact on your approach. So it's not just learning to use all of the notes, but once you know all of the notes and know how to read the music, then you start being able to write your own music with it. And then you can actually use it to express yourself and to understand other people as they express themselves.
Gotcha.
So what's interesting about this is while this episode is about tonality, you've also created this in marketing material, PR work for places. So what's interesting is tonality is voice, but to a degree, context and how you put words together is tonality on paper, right? And that's context. And so did you find that once you learned the tonality of your words in person and speaking them and listening to somebody else, that's what turned around and that's how you started then creating context for print? Is that kind of...
I think that what made it all come together was when I was working in the jewelry industry, I started to understand, and I knew it from studying, but there's a big difference between, going through the motions of studying and understanding concepts and actually working through them in person. And when I started to understand that the levels of decision-making in the brain, that most, your driving impulse to make an action in the first place comes from that middle brain where all the emotions are. And it's only after you're able to process that you can start to make higher decisions. It made me spend a lot more time paying attention to emotional context. And when you're doing like a public speaking class, let's say you're going to give a TED talk or something like that, there are certain considerations in vocal tone and pitch. For instance, in that case, you want to keep your audience engaged, be mindful of the core demographic of people that you're speaking to, so you're not alienating them with language. You'll do things like variations of pitch or elongations of syllables or pauses to be able to keep people engaged on that 7-second timer. But once you get into sales and you're starting to interact with one person, then you're not using a generalized communication technique, because what studying emotions teaches you is that the same thing that you can say to one person that will close a sale will walk another. And that is that change that happens, I think, in salespeople as they start to go to a higher and higher level. They start to realize how destructive going into a spiel is. And going into a spiel with your tone, with your language, it's just as bad. And so once you get really good facility with sales and start to understand the whole process, it becomes less about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And that's what good copy is too, is being able to relate to the emotional states and emotional reactions of that stimulus, the product, the person, the brand, and then being able to speak directly to those different emotional objections so that you can get them to the point where they are able to use reason. And that's a big step.
We talked about that on Tuesday. Is the first step a lot of salespeople get is they get a script, but they really have to memorize the script so they know what they're talking about. Then you add on the tonality and then you personalize the script. And I loved what you said earlier. What works for one person will make the other person walk away. And it's far, far too often that people think, oh, there's only one answer, one script, one solution. And that's not the reality of things.
Yeah, because there's a lot of times I do things that professionals say, don't do it that way because you're going to make them. And I'm like, no, it works perfectly for me because of how I talk and how I come across. And they're like, because I always ask people when I talk to them, is this a good time to talk? And they're like, don't do that because they'll hang up on you. I don't get that. 9 times out of 10, they always say yes. If they say no, then we set up a new time and I still get them, but not everybody's going to be that way. I'm doing to show that I care about their time and I care about what I'm doing for them, where other people, but I don't do cold call. It's more of a warm call when I'm talking to them. So, but I do it totally opposite what other people tell you to do. And it's worked for me.
Yeah. If you know all of the different modalities of psychological and emotional reaction to a particular stimulus. Let's say you're selling engagement rings in a jewelry store. There's a certain subset of psychological reactions that are going to happen when people are coming into that store for, let's say, buying an engagement ring. Whether that's coming in with a stack of papers and 8 business cards from going and shopping all over and looking like you've seen a ghost, or following behind a really dominant, female partner, rolling your eyes like, how much am I going to spend today? You see these different psychological reactions. And it's not that you can look straight through a person like a pane of glass. It's more that you understand the individual emotional and psychological components that make up that particular reaction. And that can start to dictate your initial approach. And I think that for some, depending on the industry that you're in, because if I'm selling, time to access on a network server or something like that, my opening phrases might be a little bit formulaic just because I'm trying to get to the point where I can see whether or not I can drive interest. But in that industry, the value of the product and the cases is dependent on their emotional state. So if you start that interaction wrong, you're actually literally putting slashes through your price tags or reducing your ability to close the sale just from the greeting. So it just depends on the industry, I think.
Right.
So,
And the little difference I have is I actually, besides tones and inflections, I listen for stress in the voice, right? Where a lot of people don't do that. They just, I can tell by how they're telling me certain things, which way the conversation should go. And I don't think people take the time to learn that in today because they're so texting or emailing. When
mhm.
in reality, if you know how to understand that, and you'll do so much better talking on the phone and understanding the people that you're dealing with. And that just comes from 18, 20 years on the phone.
What I did is there's a systemized process of identifying the different types of emotional objections that a person can have before they're able to move into the cognitive. And what I've found is that the tonal approach, the words, the way that you unpack ideas, the way that you present, it's all going to depend on which one of those emotional triggers that they have. And there's just 6 of them. It's reassurance, accomplishment, character maintenance, immortality, self-identity, and trust. And I'll just do a 2-sentence definition for each one. Reassurance is, I don't know if I have enough information to be able to make this decision and feel like I'm making a good decision, and I'm afraid I need more information. Accomplishment, is this going to tick off all of the boxes for my goals before I can give myself permission to even consider it? Character maintenance, am I going to be looked down upon for the amount of money that I'm spending? Whether that's someone with a small budget and they're emotionally tied to that budget. All people have a budget. This is only if it's emotionally salient for that. But the other part of it is like a market bazaar economy. Someone comes from like a place in the world, maybe the Middle East or Asia, where the amount of money that you spend for something can actually affect your self-esteem. So that there could be an emotional objection there. You have immortality, which is the persistence of value. Is this going to be a flash in the pan, or am I going to be able to give myself permission to consider this because it's going to have long-lasting value before it goes up to the higher? And then self-identity is this solution unique enough for me to actually meet my needs, or is it just the same package that everyone else is getting? Because if not, maybe I need to keep looking. And then the last is trust. Do I trust this person, this organization, this product, this warranty? Because until I get over that fear of trust, then I'm not going to be able to go up into that higher brain and make those decisions. And just comparing 2 of them, let's say, in an engagement ring situation, your self-identity. So you want to get just this customized thing that reflects her personality.
Mhm.
And then you go over to character maintenance. Well, I've only got $1,000. I don't want her to think that I'm a jerk. So if one of those people is looking for something that's customized, that's going to speak to them, and the other one's looking to make sure that they're not going to look like a jerk, you show that ring that you're showing them plastered on the front of a catalog at $700 off. You just closed the character maintenance person. But now that person who wanted something unique is now seeing that ring plastered over the front of a catalog with thousands of people looking at it. And you're violating that emotional state. And they're not even going to consider anything that you have to say above that because you have an emotional point.
Wow.
Well, maybe she should have picked a better guy.
So,
because didn't you guys come up with it's a 2-month of your salary or something like that?
3 months salary.
3 months salary.
Yeah.
Oh, how do you know how much you spent? It's 3 months of your salary.
You just quit your
Man,
job.
that was it was so easy to come up with that. Now that's our standard from now on.
Well, that's a socially defined arbitrary value, which is where you're starting from in the first place.
Right.
You can look at it as an emotional experience and a psychosocial experience, or you could think that they're metal circles with shiny rocks that someone found. Both views are technically correct. So you have to understand what that person is trying to get out of it, and what emotional state they're in that, and the person that the gift is for in that case, because that person might have a lot of emotional buy-in, but maybe you're more on the shiny rocks we found kind of the fence, and you want to make sure that you're not missing that in that translation and giving that to them. And that's, if the salesperson understands that, it completely changes everything, because then there's this feeling of safety from being understood. And once you see something that actually satisfies those emotional objections first, then you can get them to move up and start actually considering whether or not something's a good solution for them.
So you mentioned earlier that you started this by recording yourself hundreds of times.
Hold on, before we get there,
yeah,
because that's important. But I want to go back to, you said 3 things. The last thing was trust. How do you get to where people can trust you? Is there an easier path? Is there, because you said you go through this, and then it's trust. How do you get to that point where they might trust you? Is there anything you can do differently in your tones and inflections where people can trust you from how you sound, or is it just putting in the time?
So the two triggers
then you can go to your question, Brian. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got
the two triggers that are related to that anxiety, which would be reassurance and trust, that's when you need to slow the sales presentation down. But you also need to speak at a slightly slower pace than them too, so that you are giving them the cognitive framework to start idling down their engine and getting out of that anxiety response. You also want to start using dropping frequencies on the end of those slower words and intonations, so that you're starting to cause a calming effect. You're getting that 440 hertz range and just kind of bringing the situation down a little bit. It sounds like this is really important to you. Why don't you tell me a little bit more? Did you have a bad experience with a different word? Was it this company, a different company? Why don't you tell me a little bit more about it so I can make sure it doesn't happen to you again? If you give that person the valence to be able to vent and express that experience, and you can identify how it made them feel, how they got there, and why it's creating an objection now. And then you're thoughtful enough to use check questions and to keep the process slow until it's ready to speed back up after you've satisfied that emotional objection. That's the correct way to respond to that. Because, we've all seen a salesperson try to skirt around an objection. And if you do that with an emotional objection that's rooted in fear or worse, anger, then you can invalidate that emotion and multiply it. And if you can get a person to talk about their experiences, the moment that they're talking to you about that experience, they're no longer including you in that experience. And that process of communicating also causes a cognitive reframe in that person, which starts to elevate us to the next step of the sale.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. So going back to that, you mentioned you record yourself hundreds of times, and there's a lot of people who hate to listen to their own voice. So what do you recommend for people who hate to listen to themselves, but they need to go through that exercise to figure out what's their tonality? Like, for example, I used to work with someone who everything sounded like a question. So whenever she talked, at the very end, she always raised her voice. And you're like, is everything a question, right?
Was that a statement or a question?
Exactly. Like, you're feeling good today, right? Everything sounded like a question. And so I don't think she ever would listen to herself. But what are some tools or tips you can give people to help them with their tonality aspect?
So speaking from the psychological and emotional reaction to hearing your own voice, there is a slight difference in the frequency range and the way that it goes into your ear, because not only are you hearing the reverberations of your own voice, but you're also getting resonance in the middle ear, you're getting vibrations in the skull. And that means that there's a slight frequency difference between the voice that you are speaking and the voice that everyone else hears. And it's kind of like seeing yourself in a double mirror for the first time. And even though that's the way that everyone's always seen you, it looks like an alien face to you because it's not familiar. So the first exercise that I try to help people with is, rather than using their own native bass voice for starting to practice intonations, I have them develop a fake voice, whether that's with an accent or a different tone, or maybe half an octave up or low, because it is the proximity of the voice that they're hearing to the voice that they identify under that creates that almost uncanny valley disgust at that voice. And so by stepping over that, we start to get a little bit better at doing role playing. And role playing is incredibly important in sales. And the reason is that we all have objections that are easy for us, and we have objections that cause problems. And if you don't role play, if you don't go through that process and bounce ideas back and forth with someone, then you're forced to learn in the trenches in an actual sale where the stakes are very high and you're going to lose. And instead, you give yourself the opportunity to get over the awkwardness. And getting over the awkwardness of role playing, that takes some time for some people. They can feel ridiculous about it. But the moment that you start to actually use it to gain facility, everything changes, because now you're able to practice those situations, practice those different ideas, and take a look at the output.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, that's why Brian got divorced. He wouldn't role play.
That's right.
Had to do that. But for me, what I tell people is put a set of headphones on, because that's how you really sound to everybody else. I had no idea how I really sounded until I got on radio, right? You can hear yourself, but you really don't know how you sound. And it's not as bad as you think it is. But for most people, there are a couple people, there's nothing you can do about it. Right. That's
Well,
just
I
how
have sensory processing disorder. So the process of hearing my own voice actually was one of the things that was causing me to be nonverbal. So I had an extra challenge there. And I have to hear the resonance of my own voice in a different way for me to be able to do that. Wow. And so what I've learned to do is kind of study my own voice like a bug. And instead of thinking of it as coming from me, thinking of it as, is it going in the right direction? Am I using the correct tone control? And I'm thinking of it as something that I'm painting with instead of something I'm associating with my identity. And I had to divorce that before I could do that.
Wow. Some questions from what you mentioned earlier. You mentioned 75% nonverbal till age 11, but then you said you weren't diagnosed till 25. So
until I was 19.
Okay, 19.
And then I didn't have my first real friend until I was 25.
Okay. But you ended up in the military. Was that hard to be around so many different people at one time, especially with having sensory issues, where you're in a barracks, right? So a lot of loud noises, a lot of people around all the time. How did you adjust to that environment?
Well, the two rates that I got exposed to, when I was waiting for my security clearance to go through for crypto, for a while, they were playing with the idea of putting me into like ETFC. So I was over at the Tech Core building. And between those two rates, I mean, you basically have a whole bunch of really introverted people who love dealing with lots of information. And, if you go to a barracks where you've got, a bunch of ETs and stuff, there's like weekly D&D games and stuff. So, the idea that it's like a college frat or something, honestly, that negative experience you're talking about, that actually comes from working in traditional sales. Because when you go to like a manager's meeting for like jewelry stores, let's say, that is an entire industry that is dominated by extroverted feeling types. Right. And they are, playing their music and shaking their pom-poms and high-fiving each other and doing their little craft projects with their Sharpies. And let's put 1,500 people in a hallway and march them down. And, that was really hard. Then I had to, use ear protection and field of living glasses. And, that was hell. Hanging out in a barracks with a bunch of nerds. And then on top of that, I'm in the military. And so I actually know my schedule, my expectations. I understand who I'm supposed to address which way. There's a sense of comfort in that for an autistic person.
Would not have thought.
It was when those social relationships tried to go past that and actually tried to make friends and it wasn't working. And I started having those same problems I did before that. Then it was like, well, I mean, I got free medical care now. Maybe I should just go talk to someone. Maybe there's something I can take. And that, rabbit hole ended up, putting me up in front of 10 doctors and them telling me I was on the spectrum. And I was like, what? And then I had to respond to that. So that was that process for me.
And that's why when you said what you went into in the Navy, I was like, okay, I could get it because I was in the Navy. I understand, if you're with a bunch of hospital corpsmen or physical, that kind of stuff would be totally different than those people because we're more, like you just said, and you guys are like, just like
quiet.
You said. Yeah. Well, just they have their way. And the one thing about the military, exactly what you're going to do every minute of the day. Hurry up and wait. That's all you do all day long anyway. So.
The other thing you talked about before is when people start to hang out with each other, they can feel the same sensory thing. So you gave the example of 3 friends hanging out. Somebody kicks somebody in the shin or kicks them in the nuts or whatever it is. The other people can start to feel that same thing. Do you believe that's what led to the rise of like the Jackass TV shows and the ridiculousness that's been running? I mean, those shows ran for long, long periods of time.
I think it's more basic than that. I think that the social reciprocity that people get from whether you call it mirror neurons or mirror neuron-like effects, because there is a big contention in psychology and neuroscience as to the function of mirror neurons and what kind of correlations we can make. But we can look evidence-based at the output of that system and say, okay, We can look and say that peer dynamics absolutely have an effect. Here they are. If you're able to watch sports and get involved in what's going on, your brain has made a peer relationship with that person that's running down the field. And that means that in a phantom way, you were running down that field. You were trying to catch that pass. When they have that victory, you were cheering. And when you start to involve yourself, you don't even have to involve yourself with a living, breathing person. You can add things to your peer group that are forms of stimulation, different, animals, pets, especially if we're in a culture where we're desensitized to, violence, aggression, bad news, whatever. Many people will have a much worse reaction to seeing an animal get hurt than seeing the same thing happen to a human being, because we're so inundated, and we learn to attenuate those social responses.
Wow.
For my first question would be, how do you deal with hosts who don't follow your script that you provide for them?
I've been teaching this stuff and doing this
No, I'm
for
looking at
17 years. I could talk. This is my autistic special interest. We could do this for 5 hours, and I would be happy as a clown.
Because I've never had a guest send us the script, how we're going to do, okay, 10 minutes of this, 15 minutes of this. And, that, and I understand from your background where that comes from, but I'm one of those guys that you can give me a script and we'll follow it to a certain point. But does it throw you off when people, because you want to have, like you said, in the Navy, you had structure, you had this. Do you still need that structure for yourself these days, or can you more flow with things?
So I'm in this really cool group. I'm a founding member of this group called the Octopus Movement, and it's a group of nonlinear thinkers. And some of them are neurodivergent, some of them are just nonlinear, and what's really cool about that is that you get really used to people deconstructing their processes, skipping over to different parts of the movie because that's the part that they're interested in, and people zeroing in on different things. But I think that there's an impression of autism where there is this, like we're trying to build everything up with building blocks and everything needs to be just so. And it's not like that. That's the perception that comes at looking at the end result of that system. But when you have that autistic magnifying glass, it's not that you're investigating these individual threads, it's that you're processing massive amounts of information. And then when you draw conclusions later, you're able to connect the dots of that asterism to be able to do it. But as a result of that holistic understanding, because you do want to deconstruct the system and understand every piece of it, then if someone asks you a question out of nowhere, if two things are interrelated, you don't even need to think about it because you've already, in the process of making all of those observations, been excited about whether or not this or that is connected to this or that. And it's like living the information instead of studying it.
Yeah, because people have to understand nothing's going to flow perfectly. And if you can get to a point where you can flow with it, anybody else should be able to understand things are going to not go exactly the way you want it, and you should flow with just because you can sometimes, like, the person walks in, they're ready to buy, but you want to do your script to them, and they're like, shut up, you're talking me through the sale, and I'm going to walk out of here unless you sell this to me.
I've closed a 14,500 engagement sale in about, I think it was like 22 seconds, and it's because I saw the social dynamics. I saw the personality, stimulus coming in. And when the guy went to go sit down, he tapped his back pocket to make sure he had his wallet after rolling his eyes. And I was ready. I just went right in, and it was probably, I didn't find out their names until I was filling out the repair ticket. And you have to recognize that sometimes that desire for novelty, or maybe someone wants that self-identity process and they want it to be different. Or maybe someone works in sales and the idea of a person presenting and closing would almost kind of disgust them a little bit, like they're a shark being thrown into a shark tank. So being able to respond and dynamically change the process of the sale is not just important and crucial for sales, but it's also crucial for learning and understanding. Because when you take things that you've been brewing up in the laboratory and you try to apply them to the real world, the real test is whether or not they're going to be able to apply the dynamics of the situation. And I think that learning to think on your feet And understanding the systems rather than rehearsing them is really important, because then you can jump around any which way you need to, and you already know where you are.
All right. Go ahead,
So,
Brian. You're thinking there. We could see your eyes go up.
Yeah, no, I was just listening because it's so fascinating to me that the way you're able to dissect and the deep study you did to understand all these things and how you apply it to so many different types of industry, retail to organizations, putting in print, PR, everything else. Because of the type of clients you have, and I know you have NDAs on a lot of things, you and I had a conversation once before on a particular type of client that you have where they have to build relationships ahead of time, but it's a lot of emailing or text messaging to get to know people versus we were talking about phone calling today. What mistakes do most people make if they have to go to a print type media, text message, email? What big mistake do you think most people trying to attempt to either create a relationship, get an appointment, or make a sale do wrong in print?
Do you want the mistake by prevalence or how big it is?
Let's do both.
I don't. How long do we have?
Yeah.
The biggest
How long will it
mistake,
take you?
The biggest mistake that people make in print is rather than using the print to connect to the target audience, they're using the print to handle the target audience.
Oh, okay.
If a question that's frequently asked, if I answer that question in person in a dynamic way, because there's different frameworks that can make that question come up, and that can allow me to build rapport, drive action, and show that person that I understand them, then that should never be on my frequently asked questions list. If you're putting that question there, it's because you're sick and tired of answering the question. And that has nothing to do with the customer. That's on you. So understanding that sometimes when you answer a question, if you do it out in the open because when we're designing copy, let's say, right, you have to try and think of that average avatar. How inclusive can I be with the disparate demographics that I have? So I'm not alienating, this person or that person with language. But we sometimes don't consider that exposing answers to particular questions devoid of context can actually send the people who are on the outskirts of those demographics running for the hills. So if a question is important, then you want to create a nod to it. But what you want to do is you want to talk about the different dynamics that go into answering that question and why you're excited to answer it in person. If it is something that it's just procedural, then sure. But that's the first problem is handling people. And it comes out of this desire to you want to systemize, right? Entrepreneurs always want to systemize.
SOPs, standard operating procedures, right?
No, but he's talking systemized so that you can get you can grow the company, you can do more things because you have a system to get them through the process, right? And we all try to scale our companies by putting systems in place to see if we can scale it so much larger, but it doesn't always work. And I don't think people understand that.
I think the second one is that people assume that everyone should arrive to your selling solution through the same funnel. And sometimes the approach that you need to really get in your teeth into a particular demographic needs to be tailored to that demographic to actually be efficacious. And if you try and mix that with another demographic that is also important to you, you will invalidate both parties. And whether that's a person who's looking for that customized solution and they want something that's bespoke, and then you're trying to put packages on the same screen, having different ways for different people to arrive at your funnel and being willing to take the time to write compelling copy that speaks to those pain points, dreams, objections. Because if you have only minor overlap between your demographics, you can either make an avatar that's very, very limited in the middle, or you spread apart your funnels and go to different places that these people live and have a way of bringing them to you that is more unique to that specific demographic. And if you can wrap your mind around that, one of the cool things about doing that as a salesperson is you already know, because you've separated those two demographics, that their base concerns, their base budget, their base interest, because of the source of where they came from, is different. And ergo, you don't have to worry about starting with the same presentation between the two, because you already have given yourself actionable information based on where they came from.
Wow.
And you're a current example of what you just said is where you alienate both parties would be a Bud Light situation that just happened, right? I mean, that's they had a great purpose in mind for themselves and what they're trying to do, but in reality, it alienated so many people. And I don't care where you fall on that and what you believe or whatever. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just they didn't have the right message. It should have been. They should have had Caitlyn Jenner. Nobody would have cared.
Build Bear right now has a RuPaul specialty drag queen bear that they are selling, but you won't find it on a poster on the front of their store because they're not stupid.
Right. I mean, and that's it. You got to understand, everybody has to, they look at whatever your product through their eyes of what it means to them.
Right.
And when you try to change that in their eyes, then, it's over, so unfortunately, just like today, unfortunately has to be over.
I was going to say, I have to run here in a second, man. Thank you for joining us today. I'd love to have you back on another time when we go a little bit deeper into, once you've gotten in, you've got the cold calling done. We've talked about tonality. How do you then expand the relationships? It'd be great to have you come back for that.
You should never do a cold call.
Yeah, It should be a warm call.
If you have a person's phone number, if you have a person's name, and you were calling them cold, it's because you're not willing to do the work.
Right.
If I could have a person, I used to work, teaching sales skills for the adult industry. I can teach a person in the adult industry how to take an inappropriate nude selfie and use it to get the value of a person's home. So if you can take something as grotesque as that and use it to drive sales and action, and also be able to make some psychological observations about that person who's writing in, then think how much more you could do with actionable data.
I think you just had a lot of single people who are going to list their home now just to see what they get. But
we will have them back for that, because I think that would be another conversation that we could.
100%.
Yeah. So, thank you so much, Anshar.
Yeah, thank you so much. Hey, hang on for 1 second while I wait for the broadcast.
You doing it, or you want me to say goodbye to everybody? Hey, thank you again for watching today. We really appreciate it. And if you like what we do here, just subscribe and share. And again, and I can't even talk today. Thank you both for being here, and make it a great day.